Chapter 10. When Alex saw the children's home, his first thought was, why do we care so much if we are caught? Here is a real building to sleep in, after all this time sleeping in the cellar in the cave. They passed through locked gates opened up for them by a drowsy old man. Then the policeman herded them into the entry and pulled a bell. The bell rang loudly in the courtyard. The boys were downcast and silent. Anya and Miska were crying and clinging to Peter. Peter, restless and angry, looked stony. The policeman muttered, cursed, and rang again. Finally, a small old woman answered the door. Her face was in drapes of wrinkles, her eyes so light and pale in color they seemed transparent, her hair hidden beneath a ragged scarf. Not another load, she grumbled. Where am I supposed to put them? Can't this great new government build another shelter here? This little woman looked like a grandmother, and Alex had expected a gentle voice. Instead, its deepness and roughness surprised him. Shut up, babushka, because it's a word for both a scarf and a grandmother. Shut up, babushka, grandmother, one of the policemen said. You're lucky you don't get even more. The town is full of waifs, very early this year because of the weather up north. You will just have to fit them in with a shoehorn. The woman only grunted, and the policeman turned abruptly and left. Quickly, quickly, stupid brats, she cried to the children. You're letting in all the cold air. And they followed her through the enormous door into a hall that was far colder than the outdoors because the sun never reached it. In the hall, the air was almost unbreathable. Smoke and evil smells like a sewer were thick in the vestibule, and in another minute it became clear why. The old woman looked at them. I'm sure I've seen most of you scum here before, so I don't have to waste my time. You know the rules, and you know what will happen if you break them. Don't forget it. Now get inside and find yourself a place. She unbarred the door and started to push them into the room beyond. Wait, she said. Here, is that one a girl? She goes to the other section. And she grabbed Anya, who was cried out as the door slammed. The scene that lay before them reminded Alex of a picture of the Inferno, a book that was on the shelves at his home in Kovrov. Like the cellar in the cave, the room was lit by small fires around which filthy children sat or lay. But the oily haze in the room was denser, and the smells more hideous, since efforts were made to stuff the broken windows with rags, and the smoke and stench were trapped inside with the children. Alex couldn't imagine how many were crammed in rough bunks and corners on window ledges. The floor was littered with bodies, and from some came cries and moans. Alex drew back at the sight. Miska whimpered. Since all the bunks were taken, with several children in a bunk, Peter led his dejected band to a dark corner, far from the fires, where fewer people were. They sank to the floor and crouched there, getting their bearings, letting the events of the morning sink in. In a while, the bar on the door was thrown, and the heavy door swung open. The director entered, conspicuously carrying a leather bulletin. The Sukhsin is still here, Peter whispered. I thought he had been kicked out. Come forward, you boys who were just brought here. We have to go up, Kostya whispered to Alex, or he will beat the whole roomful, and then they'll point us out and they'll beat us up. So we will get beaten twice. Peter and his band stood and came to the door. The director held a notebook. Name, he snapped, pointing at Kostya. Next, he snapped. Next. One by one they came to give their names, their ages, places of birth. When he came to Peter, he said, I know you, don't I? And this one too? You are too old for this shelter. In the morning you will go with the police to prison and give us some room in here. Hearing this, Miska, standing but bright with his fever and weaving on his feet, cried out, No, don't send him away. No, don't. And he sprang forward, grabbing the director's coat in a piteous entry. No, you can't. We will die without Peter. The leather bludgeon in the director's hand was raised and brought down in one continuous heavy motion. A sound like rotted wood breaking, and Miska fell. Without another word, the director turned and walked out, slamming the door. It had taken only a moment, a flash in time. Peter fell to his knees and gathered Miska up. Make a place for him, he ordered, and his band pushed ahead of him, forcefully evicting two waifs from their bunk and laying Miska upon it. Blood oozed from the place where the bludgeon had fallen. Who has some vodka? Peter shouted. Come on, you pigs. Don't you think I know you have some vodka? Give what you have, or I will personally beat up each one of you. A boy slowly detached himself from a group lying nearby and handed over a bottle with an inch of liquid in it. Peter sniffed it, put a drop on his tongue, and then poured it over the wound. Miska's breathing was so shallow it could be scarcely heard. Kostya, Ivan, lie across his feet. Alex, lie on one side of him and I'll lie on the other. We'll try and keep him warm. What had happened had left Alex feeling as if he himself had been struck. He felt a sympathetic pain. Whoa. He felt a sympathetic pain in his head, and his heart palpitated as if he had been running. Even so, when the palpitations had eased somewhat, his fatigue led him finally into sleep, while he gave his body's warmth to the ailing child. In the morning, Miska still had not opened his eyes, and his breathing was still shallow. Peter went to the barred door and banged on it. Babushka, he yelled. He did that over and over until finally the old woman came and opened the door. Stop the racket, she shouted. Your gruel will get here when I get here. Chort Tizaba Biri, the devil be with you, Peter shouted. I don't give a damn about the filthy swill. There's a terribly sick and injured child in here. He needs help. Medicine. Tell the director. Look who's giving orders, the old woman snorted. The door slammed, and Peter went back to watching Miska, snarling and cursing in a way that was not like the Peter they knew. A little later, a bucket of gray gruel was brought in by the old woman and the old man who guarded the gate. The waifs rushed or shuffled over to it and dipped into the bucket with their own bowls. Did you tell the director? Peter demanded. I told him, she answered. Yes? Well, what did he say? What do you think? She snapped. The old sot, Peter exploded. The old dryan. He's probably still in his feather bed in a vodka sleep. Don't scream at me, the old woman said. I'm just an old woman who has to live too. I do my job. You know, Ivan said, coming up and speaking to her very sweetly, you're almost like a real human being. Then he barked, they just forgot to give you a heart. A good thing, too, the matron said. If I had one, you thieves would cut it out and eat it. So the boys laughed. Why, the old bitch is just as like a dear ugly mother to me, a waif said, sidling up to her. She doesn't need a heart. All she needs is to know how to cook up a pot of soup or gruel. That's what she's good for. The old woman kicked him away. Please, Peter begged now. This child is badly hurt. The old woman looked around the room. Which one is he? Here, Peter said, leading her to the bunk where Miska still lay without moving. He looks no better or worse than the rest of you, she said. He's sleeping. His head is open, Peter said. The wound will fester without proper dressing, and he was so sick with fever when he came. He's sleeping, yes, but he doesn't awaken. What do you want me to do? The woman asked. She sounded almost reasonable. Everyone is sick. Where had Alex heard that before? From Miska, he thought, when he first arrived in the cellar. The old woman shuffled away. They get better or they don't, she said. Tell the director, Peter shouted, furious again. Tell that pig of a director that the child he struck last night needs a doctor. Doctor! She laughed and opened the door. Even the waifs, who'd not been paying much attention to the fur in the corner, snickered at that, but did not distract themselves more than a moment from their aimless pursuits, smoking, playing cards, drowsing, catching lice. And while you're at it, Peter shouted, tell him that if he ever sends me to the police, I will tell the commissars a thing or two of what he has done, now and in the past. I would like to go out and find Boris and poke out his eyes, Kostya said. What will happen to Boris now will be a big punishment, Peter said. He will live in that cave with those criminals, perhaps all his days. Once again, Alex allowed himself to think of the future. How, he wondered, will the rest of us live out all our days? It came to him almost as a new fright that he could not see past living in a cellar or cave, being caught and brought to this pest house. A few of the waifs in the shelter had pulled themselves to their feet, squeezed through the broken windows and out into the courtyard behind the building. Alex could see them hoisting each other over the wall and pulling up the last companion. But if they can get out, why did they come back? Alex exclaimed. Why are we staying here? Don't worry. As soon as Miska is better, we'll get out, Kostya said. We have to pick our time, though. As for these others, most of them don't care about being free on their own. All they want is a place to flop with vodka and cocaine. This place is a laugh compared to Moscow, Kostya said. In Moscow, when they get you in, it's harder to get away. Is it as bad as this? Alex asked. So terrible? They're all terrible, Peter said. In Moscow, Leon said, there is one shelter where they have real cots. You sit at a table for supper and they give you a spoon to eat with. You have a bath sometimes. They give you some clothes. But it is just like being in a cage. They are always bringing in foreigners to see you, to show how perfect the shelter is and what good care the government takes of you. There was nothing at all to do there. Even so, if they were all like that, it wouldn't be so bad. Once I even tried to get back in there in the freezing weather, but they only take a few. All day they watched over Miska. Kostya and Ivan went over the wall and came back hours later with a loaf of bread and a bottle of vodka. Don't tell me how you got it, Peter said. I'm afraid I know. Please, comrade, Ivan said, crossing his eyes and putting on another of his shows. Please, comrade, my little brother has a terrible fever. Will you kindly give me that loaf of bread you are carrying, and also that bottle of vodka? Oh, surely, my boy, Kostya said, sticking out his stomach and pretending to be a fat old man. Take it and take these roubles too, so that you may buy your little brother some medicine for his fever. Don't worry, Ivan said to Peter. We only knocked him over. He wasn't even hurt. When night came, the matron and the old gatekeeper entered with a bucket of bean soup, thin, wicked, and sour, but hot. Babushka ladled it into their bowls as they crowded around her, taking their insults and their taunts with a choking laugh or a rough return of her own. Occasionally she would give a quick shove to one of the boys who crowded her or abused her, and the strength of those small arms was astounding. Even a big and swarthy lad was thrown upon his back. That one is made of iron, Kostya said. Don't tangle with her. Boys returned through the windows, carrying bottles of vodka, cigarettes, and other things. Night fell. The noise, the smoke, the odors, the hateful atmosphere made Alex wish to go through one of the windows by himself. But if one could go, why stay with this unsavory band? But he now felt like he'd be leaving his family. It was during his turn to keep Miska warm, sometime in the deep night, that he sensed a difference, a strange silence, a suspension. It was nothing you could say that you could It was nothing you could say that you heard or did not hear, felt or did not feel. It was simply known. Fear engulfed Alex, and he awakened Peter. Peter, come see Miska. Peter leapt up and came to the bunk where Miska lay, as he had lain for over a day and a night. He knelt beside him, felt his hands, his head, put his face to his chest and his mouth. Then he banged his fist against the hard floor and put his face in his hands. When, finally, Peter raised his head, Alex could see, in the pale, oily glow of the fires, that his face was contorted, his fists clenched and striking the air. Then he reached over and covered Miska's face with the rags that were covering his body, touching him gently. Alex did not need Peter to tell him. He had known even before he called out that the light, burning low in Miska, had gone out, died. Peter went over to where the others of the band lay, shaking them awake one by one. Come, he said hoarsely. We're going now. Miska is dead. His voice sounded strangled when he said it, even though he had it in a hard way, a rough way. The strange light in the cavernous room lit the sleeping children. Cries, coughs, groans tore holes in the oily haze as Peter, his mind smoking like the fire, his soul grinding in hatred and anger, led his little band through the maze of bodies to the window, signaling them to be silent. They eased through the window, tearing their already torn rags on the rough edges, scraping their flesh, and found themselves in the courtyard, patterned by the dark shadows of the wall. Start going over and wait for me, just outside the far corner of the wall. Now hurry. Where are you going? Kostya asked. Never mind, I have something to do. We'll do it with you, Ivan said. No, I have to do it alone. Be quiet now, or you'll spoil everything. He watched them cross the dark courtyard and then turned and ran to a corner of the building where the stone drain pipe rose to the floor above. He was like a serpent, then into the corridor, quietly moving, holding himself against the wall, sinking into the shadows when he heard a sound. Then, so quietly that he might have been doing this in a dream, he turned the doorknob and let himself into the room where the director snored in his feather bed, his bludgeon by his side, his stove burning brightly, and his enormous brass samovar steaming. In one leap, Peter was beside the bed and had grabbed the bludgeon, poking the ugly man awake with it. Sovolach, Peter hissed. Wake up. Wake up, you Dryan. Here you lie in your feather bed with your stove nearby, while below sick children, his voice caught here, freeze, starve, die. I have seen you and your wickedness for many years, and you are even less a human being than you ever were. Now I am going to fix your brutal hands so that you cannot maim another child for a long time. And he raised the bludgeon. The director had lain there, seemingly paralyzed, his mouth and eyes wide open, but now he lunged, his great fat hands closing around Peter's throat, letting out a scream as he did so. Immediately, Peter dropped the bludgeon to try and release the strangling grip, but the man was stronger than his soft flesh would suggest. The two, locked in a struggle, thrashed about, Peter venting the hate of years as his hands fell on the ugly man's face. The director's cries brought the old woman to the door. She too cried out, but watched the fight, not moving. The two combatants now crashed off of the bed onto the floor, the weight of their bodies causing them to roll, one on top of the other, until they were stopped suddenly by the legs of the heavy table holding the samovar. The force caused the heavy brass vessel to teeter. For a moment it balanced precariously on the edge, and then fell with a terrible crash, spilling its boiling contents on the director, its enormous weight landing on his head. The grasp released. Peter's arms were scalded. He pulled them back, but the release of the hands on his throat gave such relief that the pain of the burn was not immediately felt. The old woman held her hands over her mouth, staring with horror at the director, who did not move. Now Peter, gasping for breath, looked at him. He leaned forward and put his face near the man's mouth. He raised the eyelids, listened to his heart. The man was dead. Peter stood. He moved quickly to the doorway. The old woman shrank back, holding herself from him. Then Peter started to run. He let himself out and down the same way he had come. In the background, the old woman's voice could now be heard calling for help. But Peter did not immediately make for the corner of the wall where the rest of the band waited. Instead, he ran around the building to the opposite side. Pushing some rags from a window, he hoisted himself in. Then he started to search a room that was much like the one they had all just left, except smaller. He moved up and down the rows of children, sometimes turning one over. He stood for a moment in the middle of the room, slowly scanning shadows, trying to ignore the cries that came from some of the bodies. It took him several minutes more, but then he found her. Anya was curled like a cat on a window ledge, sleeping soundly. He lifted her gently and hurried to the window he had entered, whispering to her as he moved. Anya, it's me, Peter. We're leaving here. Wake up now. He thrust her through the window and climbed after her. She was still weaving with sleep, but she followed him across the courtyard. Ivan was waiting, his head just appearing above the far side of the wall. When he saw them approaching, he let himself down by his toes, clinging like a trapeze artist, and Peter handed Anya to him. Then, with Ivan's help, Peter quickly went over the wall himself. In the background, lights were being lit, and the alarmed voices of the old woman and the old man could be heard. Follow me, Peter now said, quickly. And they were running silently along the walls, then down the sleeping streets to the outskirts of the town. Across the dark fields they ran, frightening the mice. The night sounds of the caucus came to them over the rolling field, from the rocky crags, the restlessness of birds and animals, rivers turning, tree limbs cracking. But also the night brought a quiet that made Alex think of old Toka and the nights he had spent in the quiet woods. You can hear the ferns growing, Toka used to say. You can hear the snakes shedding their skin. Now they started their ascent, stumbling in the dark as they climbed the foothills. As yet nobody had spoken. No one had said what was in their hearts. But when they came to a place far from the children's shelter, an hour's climb for a mountain goat, they rested, throwing themselves on the stony ground to regain their breath. Then Peter said, Miska was murdered by the brute director. Now I have killed the murderer. They all stared at him, not believing it. Do you understand me? Peter said almost tonelessly. I have killed him. Anya, who had been weeping softly ever since she had been told by Ivan of Miska's death, now stopped crying and said firmly, Good. I have not wanted to kill anyone in my life, Peter said. He shook his head again and again as if he could not believe that this had happened. No, he said, as if reassuring himself. With killing everywhere, I did not want to kill. What would Jacob the baker say to me now? But I have caused this man's death, and I will have to pay for it somehow. Certainly they will look for me, and then they will arrest me. No, Kostya said quickly, we will leave this place. They won't find you. We'll go back to Moscow. Yes, what will you eat there? Peter asked. It can't stay frozen forever. No, just long enough for you to starve. Then at last we'll have to play a rougher game, Leon said. No, Peter said emphatically. What do you mean, no? Leon said. You just said you killed a man. Not for food, and I did not mean to do it again. It was an accident, but even so I killed him. Alex had been hearing this as if he were floating high above it, a witness. Despite the exhausting run from the shelter, the astounding and shocking thing he had just heard from Peter, his mind seemed clearer than it had been in months. If I were head of a government, he said, I would not allow thousands of children to run around in rags and starve, having to steal and even kill to stay alive. The first thing I would do, the very first thing, would be to see that the children got food and a warm place to sleep. Like a children's shelter, maybe, Kostya said sarcastically. Like a lovely children's shelter with a fatherly director like that one? Ha! Let me tell you something, dreamer. As soon as the government does something for you, you are a slave. The Bez Prigioni are not slaves, at least. There are places where it is different, Alex said with a sudden reassurance. How do you know? Kostya said. How do you know that not all places are not the same, where people are slaves of the government? Because my teacher, Katriana Sergeyeva, told me so. Listen, Leon said, it's the same here with the Tsar or with the Bolsheviks. The people have nothing. They are not free. But we are free, Kostya said. We are free. It surprised Alex to hear his own voice out here in the bright night of the Caucasus. It was as if the confusion had suddenly been lifted, and in seeing the present, he saw the possibilities of the future. Okay, he said, you're right. We are free. But what can we do with our freedom? What kind of nonsense is that? Kostya asked. We can do anything we want. But what do we want? Alex said. Do we want to spend the rest of our lives doing nothing but trying to find food, freezing, wearing filthy rags? It was the first time he brought these thoughts forward, even to himself. In the back of his mind, he had thought of this period with the band as a little piece of time, a transition between his own life and Kovrov and the unknown future. Now he was saying, if this is the future, I do not want it. No, he said more to himself than to anyone else. There has to be something else. And like an echo from the hills in his mind, there played back the voice of Katriana. There must be some place better. I wouldn't like to live another way, Leon said. No Bolsheviks, no Tsar. Tell me what to do and what kind of crops to grow. I have no house for them to burn. I go where I want. I'm a traveler and an explorer. Chorchizbaya Biri, Ivan said. You dunce, you. Don't you remember any more what it's like to live with a family? To do tricks on a high wire with your family? That is better than this freedom, many times. Through all of this, Peter had been sitting clenching and unclenching his burned hands, occasionally thrusting his head into his hands or staring off into the darkness. Now a silence grew and spread among them, and it was full of fear for Peter, full of grief for Miska. It was unspoken as they kicked pebbles, dug heels into hard dirt, but it was there. Thinking of Miska now, Alex had a sudden vision of a white funeral he had seen for a young child. A small cart with white pillars carried the coffin, and on the cart a young girl sat holding a golden icon. Behind the cart a priest walked, intoning psalms. Today such funerals were not allowed for the people, but he had once seen a red funeral of an important town official. It was a large scarlet hearse with gold columns and 6 outriders with orange coats and cocked hats. There were red flags and trumpets, drums, cymbals, and red flowers. Pictures like these stayed in his mind, as pictures remain in a storybook. And the mourning they were doing now was like a funeral, Alex thought, but not a funeral. He wandered a little way into the night by himself, thinking of the small, rag-wrapped foot beneath the barrow as he had first seen it, the eager face listening to him reading, the cold blue hands tending his fever and giving him tea. Now that the high tension of the escape was behind them, this time to think gave him the kind of pain he'd felt when his family was gone, the feeling of things stopping. Could that first loss only have been months ago, not years? He felt so much older.